Hi. So let's continue with our study of being and nothingness. So far, we've looked at some of the introduction, the section called "The Pursuit of Being," and a couple of portions of chapter one called "The Origin of Negation." So we're going to continue today with that chapter called "The Origin of Negation." Chapter it's a really quite amazing. It's about 50 pages long, but it could have been the whole book. He talks about so much stuff in here so richly. It's really kind of the essence of existentialism in 50 pages. And so you could really spend a lot of time studying this. We're going to just wrap it up today. We're going to look at it briefly because we're going to look at some other 50-page sections in the book that are really amazing. But don't make the mistake of thinking that because this is just one short chapter at the beginning, you should get past it onto the real stuff. Like, this is the real stuff. This chapter is if he had only published this, he would have been worth remembering in the history of philosophy. But anyway, yeah, so this chapter, it's called The Origin of Negation. What's it about? Well, it's basically about freedom. It's about the nature of freedom. And that's what we're going to continue talking about. In the introduction, remember, we distinguished being for itself and being in itself. And we talked about being for itself as the very kind of reality that consciousness has, that we have insofar as we are the occurring of experience. Freedom is just another word for that. What kind of existence do we have? Well, we have being for itself. What's another word for that kind of existence? Freedom. So that's what he's talking about in this chapter, and he makes that explicit about 2/3 of the way through, I guess it is, somewhere around page 60 or so. He says this is what we're talking about. We're talking about freedom, then goes on to talk about that. But let's just think about that for a second. What have we seen so far as the things that characterize our existence as happenings of experience? Well, one is that pre-reflective cogito, the pre-reflective conscience de soi, which is the way that we are always at a distance from the very object that defines our experience. It's that way that we are always not the same as the concreteness of our experience. That's one aspect then of the freedom. The other thing that we really especially looked at was the figure-ground relationship in the example of Pierre going to the cafe and so on. And the point there then is that the form, that of which you're having experience, takes in your experience, the form it takes in your experience, is a reflection of, as he puts it there, how you direct your attention. So again, the very way the object is appearing is a reflection of your freedom. Once again, so I'm trying to bring you back to those things we talked about, so you can see. Oh yeah, right. That makes sense. We've been talking about freedom. One other thing we talked about was the values that spring up like partridges. Obviously, another phenomenon of freedom. We'll talk about that again in a minute. But I wanted to do a couple of things. I wanted to say one thing about the chapter and about Sartre's language first, and then I want to say another thing about the figure ground thing, and then we'll get on to the values business. Sartre has this title, Being and Nothingness, and he has a substantial discussion in this chapter, somewhere around page 60 or something, around this notion of nothingness. And I have to say, I think it's really a waste of time. I discourage you from reading it. I think reading that is more likely to damage your understanding of Sartre than to help it. I think the things he says in the long run are okay. It's probably true what he says, but I think it's both really unhelpful and significantly misleading the way he says it. And I think the turning of his attention to that issue really misleadingly distracts you from what he's actually talking about and what the issue is. So when I teach this book, I basically always tell people not to read that section. I can't stop you from reading it. If you do, I strongly encourage you to read also a section from chapter 1 of the next section, which is called The Immediate Structures of the For Itself. That's the next part of the book. And the first section of that is called Presence to Self. And in that section, which in this translation runs from somewhere around page 119 to 126 or something like that. In that section, he again talks about this notion of nothingness, and he does a much better job there of um, explaining what it is that he's talking about. So mostly, I don't think you should be spending your time on it, but if you're gonna, I think you have to hold yourself a rule to yourself that you're going to read that section on presence to self when you read this to make sure you understand it. But I also would mostly say you shouldn't bother doing it. Second thing I would say about this chapter is right before he does that, he has two awful sections where he talks about Hegel and Heidegger. And throughout this book, Sartre is constantly talking about Hegel and Heidegger and Husserl to some extent. And the things he says about those figures are utterly ridiculous. And he's so in love with what he says about those things that he spends pages and pages. And really, once again, the things he says there are basically just all wrong. And you will likely damage yourself more than help yourself by reading them. So I would strongly recommend you not read those. When we get onto the critique of dialectical reason, in a way, that book is even worse because the first massive part of the book is him just talking about that stuff. It's terrible. But then he finally gets around to the analysis, and it's utterly fantastic. It's unparalleled in its rigor and insight and excellence. But his discussions of Hegel and Heidegger and Husserl are pretty universally awful. Anyway, so I just wanted to mention that about the chapter. So as I said, this is a great chapter, but it has 50 pages, but you can even probably take out 20 of those pages. So it's really probably 30 pages that are quite outstanding. But yeah, so we're talking about freedom. And to I guess let me say one more thing about the nothingness. One of the reasons that's coming up, and this is quite an important reason, is he's trying to show that the domain of freedom, the domain of consciousness, the domain of being for itself, is inherently, ineffaceably, irreducibly, essentially defined by the meaning of negation. And that's a pretty important point. So he says, if you think about this reality that he's calling being in itself, right, the normal way we think about what the reality of reality is, it's pretty. I won't try to get into this, but there's a lot of reason for thinking that the notion of negation in that context is always sort of a façon de parler, or something derivative and not quite real. That really there are only real positive things, and so we may have a way of talking about those that we say this positive thing is not that positive thing, but we don't think that is notness is anything. It's the way we construe a relationship between two things, but not something, to use that language, in itself. Right? That's a common way of speaking. And I said Sartre, talks about being itself kind of the way Parmenides talks about being, and that's one of the things Parmenides said: is, and is not. So you can talk about the way of is, but you drop that is not business. So you can work on those issues on your own. But the point is, there's a massive and very intelligent tradition in the history of philosophy that's oriented towards showing that negation is always a kind of misleading way of talking about what is actually affirmation or something positive. And so what he's trying to show is that's not true when you're talking about our experience, that the world of our experience, the objects of our experience, the world as we experience it, is inherently and ineffaceably marked by negation. And so what he's really trying to show in this chapter, what he's focusing on in this chapter to a significant extent, especially at the beginning, is experiences of knots, where that knot isn't just another way of talking about something that is, but the knot itself has integrity. And that we got some of that last time when we talked about seeing Pierre's absence in the cafe. And his point is the perception of absence is itself an immediate intuition. You see his not being there. And that's not just a misleading way of talking about seeing what positively is there. So I'm not going to go over that analysis again. You can reread it if you like, but that was the point he was trying to make, that the recognition of not is not a judgment about something positive. It's a direct intuition of an absence. That's, again, a theme we could explore more. It's a pretty powerful and important one. I'm not going to do that right here. I name it, though, just to help you connect with the form the reading is taking. But anyway, to begin that whole discussion of not and so on, he says, let's take an attitude. Let's look at a human attitude and see where that's present. He takes the attitude of questioning. That's more or less where the chapter begins. And he says, we're all doing that right now. We're in studying this book, we're kind of asking a question. We're asking a question of being. We want to know what reality is, and so on. So he then looks at that attitude of questioning, and that is then kind of paradigmatic attitude of freedom and a paradigmatic stance of distancing yourself from the object and introducing a kind of not. So you can look at the things he says about that. I wanted to just connect that for a moment now to that theme of figure and background. So the point there was that, I shouldn't say the point, but the part of the significance of that is it's saying that our experience always takes the form of a perception of a figure against a background. Another way of saying that is the object of our experience always takes the form of an answer to a question. And so he said, you will encounter the scene, but what you encounter in encountering that scene, that setting, will be reflective of where your attention is directed. And directing your attention is kind of another way of saying asking a question. There's something you're looking for, and that's an attitude of questioning. And so it's because you're looking for something that something becomes perceptually salient, significant. And so what you see reflects the questions you bring to it. So we relate to our experiential environment in a way that is always encountering answers to questions that we are bringing. So that again is a point worthy of independent pursuit. We won't pursue it here, but I'll name it. That idea that our experiences takes this form of question and answer. That was a central theme developed and raised by R.G. Collingwood, one of probably the greatest of the British idealists, or one of the greatest of the British idealists. Bradley's pretty powerful too. But he wrote quite a bit about the logic of question and answer, and that was then taken over by Gadamer. So that theme that our experience has this sort of question and answer structure is a pretty interpretively powerful one, and you can see that here in the remarks Sartre is making, first about the questioning attitude, and then about the notion of experience taking the form of a figure against a background. So again, I want to say that I'm really just trying to help you read the chapter, right? I'm trying to connect the themes we're talking about to the specific things he's saying, and I want to bring that now to the later part of the chapter where he talks about values. So he said that our everyday immediate experience is practical experience, where we're responsive to the exigencies of a situation. But the exigencies of a situation, in other words, the demands that the object of our experience confronts us with, are themselves more basically reflective of our own projects, right? It's only because I am committed to the project of going to work that the ringing of the alarm clock summons me to get up and get to work, right? So I experience that as sort of the world calling me into a particular kind of action. But the world can do that only because I have already invested it with a certain kind of value. And so, we talked about this, about walking down the street and having a experience that you should stay away from the curb or something like that. All these ways that shoulds are sort of popping up all over the place for us in our experience, and our action largely takes the form of an intelligent responsiveness to that is primarily unreflective. But the point is, the point pertinent to what we're talking about now, is that those values that we're responding to are not matters of being in itself, in the sense that they're just factual features of the world. They're not facts. They are objective in the sense that they are structures of the object of our experience. Right? But they're not exactly realities. And in fact, in this chapter, he calls them idealities. And that is because they are ways that the experience is meaningful to us. But meaning is itself a reflection of the questions that we're asking. Meaning is a matter of being meaningful for me, which means speaking to my perspective, which means um, reflecting those values that I have brought to life through my freedom. Um, so I want to read you a quotation about that. Um, this is from page 76. He says, a value can be revealed only to an active freedom, which makes it exist as value by the sole fact of recognizing it. I think that's a pretty powerful line. And again, he says later on page 176, he refers to free being as a being by whom values exist. He says a little bit more after that, which I'll come back to in a minute. But I just wanted to bring that out. So the thing is, a value is something that speaks to the kind of being who can recognize it. And insofar as values um, basically are matters of saying should, of specifying ideals you have to answer to, obviously they only speak to agents. Obviously they only speak to those beings that are capable of acting and that are capable of answering to an imperative, recognizing one and answering to it, which also means capable of not answering to it, capable of turning away from it, right? These values are realities for free beings, or in the word he uses, idealities for free beings. And I want to think about that issue of value, especially with respect to fear. Um, we, pursue it in all kinds of ways, and we pursued it to some extent the last time when we talked about that issue of walking down the street and so on. But I want to think about it with respect to fear, and we're going to come back and think about it with respect to ethics a little bit later. Um, but just with respect to fear, I want you to think about this: that something is frightening to you. Uh, Again, basically because of what you value. Like he talks here, and I might come back to this example in a minute. But he says, there's an artillery bombardment. You're a soldier at war. You might be afraid that you're going to die. But not everybody's afraid they're going to die. And I would take, for example, Socrates. If you've read the Apology, Socrates really kind of emphasizes that death is not something he's afraid of. He doesn't particularly want to die, but it's not frightening to him. And that's a way of the part of the point he's trying to make there is that um, that is a matter of values. He cares about these things in this way, and the consequence of that is that death is not something he's afraid of. If you think of any of the things that you might be afraid of, maybe let's think of more familiar and sort of heightened examples. Maybe you're afraid of leaving the house because you think, oh, I got to go out in public and see all those people. But the very fact that all kinds of other people go out and aren't afraid shows you that it's not intrinsic to the nature of the outdoors that a person has to experience it as threatening. You experience it as threatening because of something about you. Um, so I want you to think about that with respect to fear. Anyway, I want then to get into this issue of fear. That's not the particular point he makes about fear, but I thought that might be a helpful way into it, to think about it in relationship to these other things, right? Think of our fears as themselves a kind of reflection of our freedom. But here he does bring it up in the context of talking about freedom, but for a different purpose, because he wants to distinguish it from anguish. And so that's what we're really going to talk about. That's going to be our real subject. But let me just go through a little bit of this paragraph, because I think this paragraph that straddles pages 65 to 66 in our translation is a really, really wonderful paragraph. So he says, first we must acknowledge that Kierkegaard is right. Anguish is distinguished from fear in that fear is fear of beings in the world, whereas anguish is anguish before myself. And then he gives some examples. And so he says, think about falling. He says, vertigo is anguish to the extent that it's not falling that I'm afraid of from a high place. It's me jumping, right? So, and he's going to go on to analyze that. But he says, there are two different things. Like you can be afraid of falling, or you can be afraid about yourself that you don't know what you're going to do, right? And the fear of falling can be called fear. Being apprehensive about what you might do, that's anguish or anxiety. It's the same, just two different ways of translating the same word. He says the same thing. The artillery preparation which precedes the attack can provoke fear in the soldier, who undergoes the bombardment. But anguish is born in him a second later, uh, when he tries to foresee the conduct with which he will face the bombardment. Or I shouldn't even say a second later. Maybe it's when it's maybe going to come. One thing is to be afraid of what's going to happen to you, but the other thing is to be uh, uptight about how you're going to behave. And that's secondly, he says that's the anxiety or the anguish. So he says, similarly, the recruit who reports for active duty at the beginning of the war can, in some instances, be afraid of death, but more often he is afraid of being afraid. Anguish before himself. I think those are great examples. And then uh, uh, he basically says we kind of typically flip flop between these two in everyday experience, and I think that is a particularly great point here. So he says, I'll just keep reading this because I think it's such a nice paragraph. He says, most of the time, dangerous or threatening situations present themselves in facets. They will be apprehended through a feeling of fear or of anguish, according to whether we envisage the situation as acting on the man or the man is acting on the situation. I think that's a really powerful and helpful way to start thinking about these phenomena. And then he gives more examples of that. And then he says, in this sense, fear and anguish are exclusive of one another. I'm reading on 66, about 10 lines down. Since fear is unreflective apprehension of the transcendent, right? Without reflecting on it, the real object seems to you threatening. And anguish is reflective apprehension of yourself. That is explicitly noticing yourself and having that be the thing that you're uptight about. Not yourself as a body in the world, exactly, yourself as a choosing power, yourself as a free being. And he says the one experience is born in the destruction of the other, right? You have to turn away from the one experience to have the other ones. And then here's this other thing that I think is quite nice. The normal process in the case which I have just cited is a constant transition from the one to the other, right? That's one of the things we typically do. We have both of those experiences, and we kind of go from one to the other, probably somewhat incoherently. Like we probably often don't acknowledge that those are two different experiences, but we sort of tie them up in a knot as if they were the same thing. And because we don't analyze it very well, we don't deal with it very well. Anyway, the normal process in the case which I have just cited is a constant transition from the one to the other. Yeah, but then he says, so that, as I said, I think is quite a nice paragraph, just as a little phenomenological description of our situations about tightness. And he's using that to distinguish fear and anxiety. Now, he says, yeah, that anguish often comes up in those kinds of situations, but it can also come up on its own, where there's really actually nothing to be frightened of exactly. So he says, for example, I've been raised to a new dignity and charged with a delicate and flattering mission. I can feel anguish at the thought that I will not be capable of fulfilling it, and yet I have not the least fear in the world of the consequences of that, of my possible failure. And I think that's a really good, a good example. There could be many more, but that's a good one. But so he uses that paragraph to kind of introduce you to the phenomenon of anguish, show you what it means, show you how it comes up in everyday situations, and also then to show you that it can come up both as something wrapped up with everyday experiences of fear, but also can be something taken up in its own right, independent of experiences of fear. And so that's pretty important. And then he's going to go on to give two examples, because now he really wants to analyze that experience of anxiety. And I'm not going to go through them in detail, but I'm going to quickly sort of outline some of the things he says. So he gives you two examples. He gives you the example of vertigo, and then he gives you the example of the gambler. And I think these are great. And they each reveal something a little bit different. Vertigo reveals anxiety in the face of the future, and the situation of the gambler refuses anxiety in the face of the past. And this relates to the thing I've already been saying about that distinctive experience of freedom, or our distinctive kind of existence as being for itself. I said last time that one of the things Sartre commonly says about being for itself is that it is what it is not, and it is not what it is, which he contrasts to being in itself, about which he says it is what it is. Here, we're going to see some of the significance of that idea that you as a free being are what you are not and are not what you are. Quick digression. You already saw that, right? The very notion of consciousness is that all you are is the happening of this world, but you are it in the mode of being at a distance from it, of being not reducible to it. So the very structure of consciousness, or the very structure of intentionality, is to uh, be what you are not. Like there's nothing more to you than what you're experiencing. That's the idea that your consciousness is exhausted in the object. So you are what you are not. You are the object in that sense. But on the other hand, you are not what you are in the sense that um, uh, you are not defined by that. And as we will especially see even more here, you're always at a distance from whatever determinacy you've given your existence. Anyway, so I just wanted to quickly note that that very idea of intentionality, the very notion of the for, that you are being for itself, uh, it already contains that structure of something that is what it is not and is not what it is. But let's turn around here with the ways he brings it up here, um, because here you really see how that is integral to freedom. So vertigo, he says, that's anxiety in the face of the future. And then he says, going back to the point he just made, when you're on the cliff, like, yeah, you might be afraid of slipping, but you might also uh, think, oh boy, maybe I'm going to jump. And one of the reasons you might want to jump is because the anxiety is just too overpowering. It's a weird and nasty little cycle. But you can find yourself in situations like that where they're intense. Like maybe it's driving, fast in a car when other cars are close to you and things are turning around. Who knows? But let's take say a frightening kind of situation. Um, you can be working hard, ideally, kind of unreflectively, trying to do that thing. But then maybe you notice that it's frightening, and then maybe you start to detach a bit and reflect, and you start to wonder how this is going to turn out, and you wonder how you're going to do, or something like that. It's easy for that to turn into an experience of uh, you becoming hyper aware that it's really up to you to make this thing work. You've got to handle that steering wheel well, or you have to make the right decisions about where you step on this steep, uneven cliff or something like that. And as your attention is drawn to your initiative, your agency, your irreplaceable role in bringing about whatever is going to come about, you can have doubts about that, right? That's when you can start thinking, oh, I don't know if I'm going to do the right thing, right? So that's there you've shifted from the danger of the situation to the kind of danger that lurks in yourself as a free being. I don't know if you're going to do the right thing. And that can be paralyzing. You can be um, uh, so uncertain about your own agency that you don't do anything. And that can be further trouble because you think, oh, nothing's happening, I can't get out of this situation, right? So, like, I just want to try to put yourself in that situation. He describes it well. I probably am not describing it excellently. He describes it very well. Which is one of Sartre's great merits, is his real literary power in describing human situations. Um, but yeah, so picture yourself in that situation and try to remind yourself of what that feels like. And one of the things is you don't know what you're going to do, and you might very well start to picture what you could do. Like, what if I did? Maybe you're up top of the CN Tower in Toronto or something, looking over the city. You might think, what if I did just step over the edge? And you can see that there are real choices in front of you that are possibilities for you. And the fact is, they're all possibilities and only possibilities, right? None of them is destined to happen. But that also means nothing else is destined to happen. Like, whichever one you're going to do, it's going to have to be you who actually goes about it and does it. And you don't know which one that is going to be. And so you don't actually know that you're not going to do those things. And he says, like, that's where this anxiety really comes up. And that's what's going on in this experience of vertigo often, is that as anxiety is anxiety in the face of your own future, right? The one who's gonna jump off or do something else will be you. So it will be you, but you now are actually not that you, right? So um, that's another version of you are not what you are or what you're going to be, or you already are that thing that you're not yet, right? Like it is you who's going to do it, but it's not up to you exactly to be able just to say who that's going to be. So your future self is going to be you, but you kind of have to find out from the future who you're going to be. Um, so there, that brings out some of that notion of you are what you are not and are not what you are. But it also really brings out this idea that um, uh, precisely because you're a free being, that you are confronted with respect to the future only by these possibilities. And that means you there's something fundamental about you, about who you're going to be, that is not exactly a fact. It's something that's going to actually have to be brought into being by you, and you will be the bringing into being of who you come to be. You don't know who that's going to be yet. You can't. You can hope it's going to be this or that. You can try to make it this or that, but you can't make it be the case by saying so now that that is what it's going to be. Um, uh, and that distance from yourself then is a site of anxiety. That is the fact of your freedom confronting you with, or it's being confronted with the fact of your freedom that's inducing that anxiety in you. He gives the similar example of the gambler, similar in the sense of that similar notion of distance from you and yourself. In this case, he says it's that same story, sort of from the other way around. Let's imagine you said, I swear I'm not going to jump off that cliff, right? And then you get in that cliff and you think, oh, maybe I'm going to jump off, right? The fact that you swore it before doesn't mean you're not going to do it. He says that's the same thing with the gambler. The gambler says, oh, I've been ruining my life by this gambling or this drinking or whatever it is. Um, I'm gonna stop, or dieting. Like, oh, I'm not gonna eat ice cream anymore. Whatever you say. But then you get there the next day and you think, yeah, maybe I should have some ice cream. Maybe I should have a drink. Or in the case, the example he gives, like, yeah, I'm gonna go play some poker. Um, he says there, what happens is when you are confronted with a real situation of you being uh, drawn by an activity, because remember the way you experience activities is as these exigencies. And if you're in the habit of gambling, then the poker room or the poker website or whatever it is just says to you, sign on and play. And so you have this kind of immediate intuition of a value built into the thing that summons you, and you're going to have to not respond to it. And yesterday you made a vow to yourself, like, I'm never going to gamble again. But when you find yourself um, actually encountering that situation with its experienced exigencies, the fact that you promised yourself yesterday that you weren't going to do it doesn't automatically make it be the case that today you're not going to do it. So there you see the gap in you as a free being between you now and you in the past. That was you, totally was you who made that commitment, and you were dead serious. But the fact that you did it there doesn't make it be the case that you now don't face the challenge of remaking that commitment on the spot. So again, the anxiety you face there is the encounter of you with the fact of your freedom. It's like, oh no, I'm free, and that means the fact that I said I'm not going to do it doesn't mean I'm not going to do it. Right? So the vertigo and the gambler, the anxiety in those two cases, what he's trying to show you is uh, that is an experience of that is you having experience of the fact of your freedom and its implications. And so that's going to become even more important in a minute. But he says, so yeah, so in our anguish, that's where we really have, I guess, a aesthetic experience of our freedom. He says, but if we're free, why aren't we feeling that way all the time? Why aren't we in anxiety all the time? And it's because our experience of our own freedom is not typically aesthetic, right? Our experience of ourselves, as we already saw with the pre-reflective cogito, is pre-thetic, pre-positional, pre-reflective. We don't take ourselves as subjects as the object of our experience. Typically, no, we have this kind of tacit, implicit awareness of ourselves as subjects, which is to say, ourselves as free beings, in experiences that take the primary form of an explicit or thetic engagement, positing engagement with some specific objective situation. And that's the stuff he then talks about here, basically between, I guess it is pages 73 to about 77. And we already talked about that in detail in the very first lecture. So I used that in the first lecture just as a way to introduce the immediate form of experience. But you can see now the context in which he's bringing it up. He's saying, well, if we're free beings and the experience of our own freedom is anxiety, why aren't we always anxious? And he says, well, because anxiety is the reflective apprehension of your own freedom. It's taking your freedom as an object. It's explicitly noticing. Whereas typically, our existence as free beings means we have an implicit or non-positional, non-positing recognition of our freedom in the context of what explicitly is a positing of an object, right? A recognizing of some objective situation. And that objective situation, it reflects our freedom, but the very way it reflects our freedom is that it presents us with values. It presents an object that is shaped and informed by values that come from what we've brought, but that we experience as something dictating demands to us, exigencies, right? The world with its urgency, he said something like that. So he says our normal experience of our own freedom is of it's kind of passive. It's the call of objects drawing forth from us the appropriate behavior. And he says, so far from being a constant experience of anxiety, our experience of the world is typically, he says, reassuring because it's always the case that um, just as I was saying, the perception of the object is kind of a structure of call and response, or question and answer. There's similarly, our behavior is kind of this experience of ongoing experience of confirmation. Like this calls for something and we do it. This calls for something and we do it. And it's like we keep getting check marks, right? And so the the um, the ongoing form of our experience is typically an ongoing experience of success in meshing with the world because we provide the appropriate response to the thing that's called for from us. And so it looks like the world's saying something and we're doing the right thing in response. And we don't see that that's subtended by a more basic way that we're demanding something from the world and it's reflecting that back to us. So yeah, so that's why he says, this is the bottom of page 75. He says, yeah, the alarm that rings in the morning refers to the possibility of my going to work, which is my possibility. And in that sense, it does announce my freedom. But to apprehend the summons of the alarm as a summons, as a demand it's making on me, is actually to get up. And so therefore, the very act of getting up is reassuring because it eludes the question, is work my possibility? Like it tells me what to do and I do it and I get it right. And it actually sort of evades the whole issue of what are you going to do, right? So we have set up a system in our lives, basically all of us, that is routines, a set of familiar routines and rules that sort of dictate to us what to do. And so we, by following the constant uh, flying up of partridges, the flying up of situational exigencies, we have the flow of our days dictated to us, and such that even though it is an ongoing experience of an enactment of our freedom, the deeper demands of freedom are never actually announced to us by our situation. In fact, they are precisely concealed in that situation. And we don't face the world always going, what am I going to do? You know, the world doesn't just confront us as this blank nothing and our freedom as this absolute power. And we think, how am I going to do this? It's, on the contrary, the world is this, as we have grown up into it, is this highly developed thing that's constantly telling us what to do, and we just roll along with that without ever asking the question of ourselves, what am I really doing? What should I really be doing? We can ask that question, but that's a kind of special experience. So he says on page 74, just before that, about 15 lines up from the bottom of the page, start of the paragraph, of course, in every act of this kind, there remains the possibility of putting this act in question. We are free beings, and we can always, in principle, have our attention drawn to that and reconsider things. But typically we don't. In fact, to do that is typically to, slam the brakes down on the flow of your life. Right? Anyway, so that's why. So I was reminding you there of the stuff we talked about before in the first lecture, and saying that's why it comes up here. He's trying to show why, even though, in as much as we are free beings, um, how we can and should and are going to act is in a certain way, in principle, in question, always. Like, it's not dictated by the world. In fact, that's not typically how we experience our freedom in the world. Right? And as he says now in the bottom of 76, just to repeat that point, ordinarily, my attitude with respect to values is eminently reassuring. So now, I want then to begin by going to his point about fear and anguish to show how anguish is distinguished from fear, but it's also typically woven together with it in everyday experience, such that even though our experience often goes back and forth between fear, anxiety, fear, anxiety, fear, anxiety, in situations where we're uptight, um, we we probably don't really recognize that. We think of it as just one experience and don't notice that there are two different, indeed completely opposed kinds of experience happening there. Um, but then there are situations where we do recognize anxiety on its own. We gave the example of that, when you get a new job and you're wondering if you're going to perform well or something like that. But then we looked at vertigo and the gambler as further explorations of that, about how that anxiety is responding to the distinctive character of the fact that we're free, because uh, you are at a distance from your own past and you are a distance from your own future. You are at a distance from yourself in as much as you were, and you are at a distance from yourself in as much as you will be. Um, so those are still going to be you. That you will be who you will be, but at the same time, that you will be is not the same as the you that you are, right? In the ways that we already spoke about. Uh, um, and so now let's come back then to the issue of values level. So that's what we've seen about anxiety. And now in talking about anxiety and values and so on, we've been talking about why, uh, nonetheless, anxiety is not the normal form of our everyday life. Um, so now let's think about that a little bit more with respect to values, right? Values are about the should. And I think his discussion here is really great. Once again, I'm not going to go through the text in detail because I think he's very readable once you know what you're reading for. But his point, his biggest point here, which I've already made, is that it's the very nature of values that they have to be adopted by someone, and therefore they don't exist somewhere other than in the context of freedom and choice, right? And so, as he says on 76 in the middle of the page, values can be revealed only to an active freedom, which makes that value exist as value by the sole fact of recognizing it as such. Right? And again, he refers to ourselves as the being by whom values exist. So here's the thing now. Well, actually, let me go back to the beginning of that paragraph and see the point. So now he says, in the same way, what we might call everyday morality is exclusive of ethical anguish. And here I think we're now really getting to a big point, and this is at the core of what I think makes existentialism existentialism. We just distinguish between the everyday unreflective response to exigency versus the anguished apprehension of your own freedom. There we were talking about, what's involved in walking down the street as a situation of values. But morality is obviously the domain of values, right? So beyond the simple navigating of streets, like we do think of morality also as that place where we specifically pose the question, how should I act, around moral rules, etc. And there he's saying, yeah, lots of people you'd think of as moral beings, but that everyday morality uh, it may be important, but it's lacking something. So that everyday morality is like walking down the street. It's a situation in which people have embraced a set of rules or something like that. They've accepted it, but those things now do not induce in those people ethical anguish. They just say, "Oh yeah, of course you should greet a person with a hello, or of course you should say thank you, or of course you should give the correct change." Like it might be nice that people are doing those things that are in a certain way right, but the thing that he's saying is noticeable there is that domain of moral experience for those people is not characterized by people asking themselves, how should I act? And indeed, it's characterized by people commonly treating those values as if they were just facts in the world and denying about themselves the role of their own freedom in adopting those values. It's as if those values were written on tablets and handed down by God, like just facts you have to notice, like trees produce apples. Uh, so those values really do exist for that person or for any person only because that person has embraced them. So at a fundamental level, you are the one who is responsible for asserting or affirming that this is the thing that should be done. So I could ask you, like, why should that be done? And you might not have an answer because you may never have gone through that question of asking yourself what should be done. You may have just, as with so many other things, like walking down the street, uh, become habituated to the view that that's how you're supposed to do things. Um, uh, that that may be an important thing. There may be a lot of profound value in that everyday morality that's just sort of customary practices handed down to people and so on. But he's saying it's distinguished from what one would really think of as profound moral experience, because the profound moral experience is going to be when you are actually confronted with, or you confront yourself with the question, how should I act? And it becomes for you an existential issue of what is right. Now, in that context, if uh, you still may presumably will and should, come to an answer, but that answer will be then reflective of your moral grappling, right? And so you will then think this is the way I have to act, and you're going to do it. But if it's come out of that grappling with the question of your own freedom, then uh, you don't have something where you're going to say, oh, well, somebody just told me this is the right thing to do, or it says it in a book, right? You're not going to be able to point to anything other than your own efforts to grapple with the questions of value. You're not going to be able to point to anything other than that to say what justifies you in doing this, right? And so that's why he says then in the middle of 76, as a being by whom values exist, I am unjustifiable, right? Um, uh, the justification for why you're doing this is you're going to say, like, because I tried to figure out and it seems to me that's the right thing to do, but there's nothing beyond ultimately you pointing to your own freedom as the justification for why you did that. So if you're going to then try to justify your own freedom, the only way you could justify that is if you had some other value you could turn to and you'd say this value justifies it. But the whole point is you can't have any value except from your own freedom. So in principle, there couldn't be a further court of appeal that would be another set of values that would somehow justify you, because you would have had to value those values. You would have been the one who had to make them count in the first place, right? So there is in these few pages here, there is actually, I think, quite a deep phenomenology of value, and that's ultimately, I think, captured well in that last section of that paragraph on 76, where he says, "It is anguish before value, which is the recognition of the ideality of values." I think that captures pretty well the overall point that's being made here. Something about the very kind of existence that values have, and the point is, um, an ethical consciousness in the deepest sense will have to be an anguished consciousness. It will have to be a consciousness, a person of freedom that has grappled with the issue of what is right. But if your relationship to that question is that you grapple with the issue of what is right, then you're kind of on your own. There isn't anything else you're ever going to be able to appeal to prove that you're right about this. And so there's a that the, that stance of ethics that is ethical anguish is not a getting away from anguish. It's a kind of living in it, an inhabiting of that anguish stance, or in other words, it is a kind of embrace of the fact of your own freedom. And so then what he goes on to talk about is how, in fact, that's typically what we don't do. Mostly, like, that's a pretty difficult and intimidating stance. You know, when St. Paul talks about it, he talks about, embracing this stance in fear and trembling. You know, it's a um, the notion of ethical anguish, or Kierkegaard talks about too. In fact, he uses that line from St. Paul's title of one of his books. It's there's an attitude in which you recognize about yourself that you're free, and that makes you the kind of being for whom questions of ultimate value are alive. But in entering into that domain, there's no escape from the fact of you and your freedom being the one who's making the choices and shaping the perspective that you're now inhabiting. And so that's a tough perspective to live. So then this is in the last point. Sartre says, most of the time people don't want to do that. And confronted with the demands of owning up to your freedom, which we call authenticity, typically in Sartre or in Heidegger, confronted with the demands of owning up to your freedom, it's actually easier to turn away from that, not take on the responsibility for basically setting all existent meanings to zero and saying, what am I going to do? And I'm going to figure this out for myself. It's easier not to do that, but to look for a route that says this is the right way to live your life. Right? So he says, completing this story now, yeah, there's the anxiety that comes up mixed up with fear. There's anxiety on its own terms. There's the anxiety that can really present itself to us around these ethical questions. Confronted with that, some people will embrace it, and that's sort of what existentialism as a sort of ethical doctrine is kind of about. It's kind of saying it's about that existential change that is the embrace of your own freedom, that attempt to be authentic in owning up to your own freedom. But confronted with that challenge, when systems of meaning in our life get threatened and so on, and the role of our own freedom is brought to our attention, many of us will try to avoid that and turn to something else to not, so that we don't have to confront the challenges and the anxiety of really trying to make our lives meaningful on our own terms. And so that's what the latter part of the chapter is about. It's about the ways that we try, it's the flight from anxiety, the ways we try to evade acknowledging and owning up to our own freedom. So that's I want to say one last little point, but that's basically where I want to end the discussion of the chapter. The distinction between this talk of ethical anxiety, which is what I'm calling authenticity. I don't think he uses that term here, or the flight from our freedom, which he calls bad faith. We adopt a way of living, even sort of in the face of already having felt our freedom, and we're trying to get away from noticing that. And that's what he talks about in those latter sections of the chapter. As I said, that's kind of the core of the familiar existentialism. That's right there. You have the reason this book was so powerful for decades in the 20th century, and caused a real cultural revolution. And there's a great deal to get out of it. we're going to go on to other things, but we're not going to study that any further. But I wanted to bring that idea out of this so that you can see the intimate connection between these sort of existentialist issues and this analysis of freedom and negation that's coming out of this chapter. Um, I want to just make one more point, just in anticipation of where we're going, but that's the end of what I want to say about the chapter right now. And that is that, uh, you know, that Anguish stance of trying to choose your values. He sort of pointed to it here as a as a stance you could have, but that we don't normally adopt. I want to just say one thing, and that is that stance of like just facing the question all the time, presumably is a bit challenging. And uh, it seems to me you can easily imagine how a stance like that would kind of deteriorate, right? Even if you really were sort of behind a choice and so on, you can see how that might turn into familiar habits again. I'd just like you to think about that. I hope saying that makes enough sense. The reason I wanted to say that is because one of the themes we're going to see throughout Sartre, which I think is pretty characteristic of him and pretty powerful, is this idea of a kind of authentic stance that is kind of hard to maintain and has a real tendency to deteriorate into other things. I think we see that here around the issue of ethics, and maybe we'll talk about that again. We would see it if we were to talk in detail about the relationships of love and sexual desire that come up in the section called concrete relations with others. I expect I'm going to mention something about that, but I think I'm probably not going to analyze it in detail here, even though it's one of the most exciting parts of the book. But we're especially going to see it when we look at social and political relations in our discussion of the critique of dialectical reason. So as I said, that's just the last little sort of addendum I wanted to put on here. If we think about this notion of trying to authentically um, own up to your freedom in a stance of anxiety or anguish, um, I want you to think about the idea that just like in the gambler's commitment to being no longer a gambler, like there's no guarantee that's going to continue. Well, similarly here, there's no guarantee that anguished embrace of your own freedom is going to continue to be the stance you inhabit. And I want you to think about how that stance can deteriorate, just in anticipation of some other things we're going to see. Anyway, that's my attempt just to take you through some of that stuff in this chapter on the origin of negation. And when we come back next time, we're going to turn to his discussion of our experience with other people.